orientated businesses. So the use case around an airline or a bank is very obvious, but what about a retailer? We'll talk about some of the features and functionalities around that and touch on some case studies around aviation, life sciences, medical devices, etc. And at the tail end, I'll discuss around the trickle-down we're seeing within compliance-type features and functionality and use cases in non-compliance-orientated businesses. A bit of a mouthful. There's a lot of acronyms in compliance and a lot of long words, which is always a struggle for me at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So this is what everyone else knows as compliance. It's life sciences, it's medical device manufacturers, people making dialysis machines, heart monitors, energy, utilities firms, nuclear reprocessing, through to government, be they government agencies like first responders, police forces, fire services, etc. One way you're wondering about compliance within manufacturing, well, quality management is all about compliance. If you're producing an automotive vehicle, you actually want to have a 100% compliance rate on the widgets and bits that go in the car. More failures means more cost. If you roll that up into healthcare and life sciences, when you're making a heart monitor, you can have zero tolerance. There must be a zero failure rate within a manufacturing facility. Within automotive, it's all about money. Within life sciences, it's about people dying and being sued. Moving on to the classic ones that everyone always associates with compliance, which is financial services. Probably not the best example in the UK at the moment. There's been a lot of fines, so I guess there needs to be a lot more focus on that. And last but not least, an area that I do an awful lot of work in on a personal level is aviation. So if you drill down into the detail what this means within a compliance-orientated environment, it's things like authenticating who someone is. And that can be a physical identification. Within an airline, it doesn't matter if you've known a first officer for the last 20 years, when they did a recurrent training or the high stakes training or type rating on an aircraft, you still physically check the photo ID of the person coming in to do an examination to be type rating on a 747-400, for example. In our case, we put a lot down to the IP range of machines in that training room, so only physically people in that room can do that training. In the life sciences industry, it's about the use of e-signatures. And e-signatures are now legally recognised as signatures within a piece of software. That is probably the biggest area where we're seeing a trickle down within our industry. And I'll touch on that as I go through. Confidentiality and the use of SaaS. We're a large proponent of SaaS within our organisation, as are many of our clients. But what we find is many compliance-orientated businesses probably have a high degree of nervousness around SaaS, particularly around multi-tenant SaaS. And also where the data is held. Is that data held within the US? A lot of things around Ed Snowden and what's happening in the US has put a lot of European organisations off hosting their data in the US. And last but not least, getting down to a little bit on the technical side, the availability of the system and also the auditability as well. If you're looking in a medical device manufacturing company, every touch point in that system needs to be auditable. You need a trace of who touched the software, when they touched it, and made a change. If you're working within a manufacturing facility, you have an SOP, a standard operating procedure on the production line. If an SOP changes, you want an audit trail of who made that change and what that change was and has it been trained on, so you can spot the defects in the system. And last but not least, our industry within compliance is full of acronyms. I could talk acronyms all day, but 21 CFR Part 11 is the Code of Federal Regulations in the US for the Food and Drug Administration. That filters through into the EU GMP for good manufacturing practice in their Annex 11. It's acronym after acronym, but what it means, these are the rules and regulations behind what we do. So just give a show of hands, see if you're in the right presentation or not. How important is compliance training to your organisation? Not at all, hands up. No one? Slightly, hands up. Moderately, hands up. Very? Hey, there's a few of you then. And critical. Okay. If I turn the question around, how important is quality in your organisation? Hands up. I'd hope it'd be everyone's hands up, because quality is what it's all about. If there's a regulator involved, we call it compliance. In every other situation, compliance actually is called quality management. It's almost the same thing. So this is from a Brandon Hall report a couple of years back, but you see it's around about 75% of that key focus around compliance around the world, and the data is largely the same within the Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Okay. Compliance training, how it's delivered in your organization. Is it e-learning, customer instruction, online simulations, virtual classrooms? Be honest, I'm not even asking for your hands up. We see it as a blend of all. Compliance tends to be quite old school in its approach. For example, in the medical device industry, even though you're using a learning management system to deliver your training, there's still a legal requirement to have paper-based documentation on everything you do in the system. Technology has moved faster than the legislation. So what you may want from your LMS is the ability to generate that paper-based documentation. As nuts as it sounds, it's all held as a soft copy in the system, but you might need to print out the information in the system as well. So how is compliance training delivered? I knew the answer already, so I wasn't going to ask you to put your hands up. It's a blend of all of the above. And the learning management system is also used for the paper-based systems as well. We're seeing the SOPs sit within the software and be tracked. It's very easy to turn an SOP into a SCORM object and track that within the software. So I use the term highly regulated or high consequence, high stakes. These terms are used largely interchangeably. Highly regulated, in my context, might mean it's regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority for financial services, EU GMP for medical device manufacturing or pharmaceutical with 21 CFR Part 11. In aviation, you have the national aviation authorities like the CAA and the European regulator EASA. What it really comes down to in these areas is the access control and the e-signatures behind it, the tracking and auditing, and compliance reporting. When we go on to compliance reporting, we also get down into the nitty-gritty of big data and analytics. With a normal learning and development environment, maybe just a dashboard reporting is sufficient. When you're drilling down into that hardcore, granular detail within compliance, analytics is often required. So the acronyms in some of those industries I showed you before, it is just a mouthful. I'm not even going to go through some of these. It's a lot of legwork. The common one at the bottom is around data protection and local labour law. So, for example, if you're working in Germany, you need to make sure that the local labour laws are adhered to. If you're within pharmaceutical, you need to make sure you're falling in line with the US FDA. As 80% of pharmaceutical products are used within the US, you have to really adhere to what the US regulations say. So, what is compliance training and where it fits within that? It is quality management. That's all it is. So if you are a business that has a high focus on quality, you should have a high focus on compliance. It is largely the same thing. Really the only difference is when it's compliance, it is governed by a regulator. So compliance training is mandatory training. It often has several courses of actions. It might have a piece of e-learning, a piece of classroom, an SOP to follow up on that. It also has a very hands-on integration by the management within that. And there's a vast amount of documentation. The documentation within compliance is ridiculous, to be honest. Everything has to be documented, and everything has to be able to be generated as a hard copy in the system as well. And that's the same within aviation as well. If the Civil Aviation Authority come into an airline, it's not sufficient just to show them what you're doing within the software. You have to be able to give them the paper-based copies as well. It's quite old school, many of the things that happen. This is my ABC kind of slide on the key principles of compliance. The first sentence is a real mouthful. You can read that one out yourself. But the last 3 points are the things that I govern what I do with every client by. One is say what you do and have a written procedure that states what you do. 2, do what you say, follow procedure. If there's a deviation in a procedure, write down what it was. And if there was a deviation, do you need to revise it and redo it again? And last but not least, this point I keep going over again and again, document it. There's daft amounts of documentation. Just because it's done within the software doesn't mean you don't need a paper-based document afterwards. So how it works within the system with a LMS compliance and around quality management is You've got those elements of security around the host infrastructure. If you're working in the defense industry, a defense company that is working on maybe our nuclear submarines or the refitting of aircraft carriers, or they're working with frontline troops or security services or police force, best one in the world, even if you've got great SaaS infrastructure, they're not going to trust ours, they want to do it on their own private cloud. You also need to be able to do an audit trail of the behavior in the system, and that's down to the database level. If someone has touched the software, you need to have an audit trail of when they touched the software, who they were, and what change you made, if any, within the software. E-signatures. E-signatures can be the most basic thing of authenticating within a system again, or it can be using a VeriSign digital signature, or it can be a biometric scan. There's different levels within the system. And also depends which area of the industry you work in. If you're making pharmaceutical products, actually an end pharmaceutical product, the regulations around that are higher than if you're making a medical device or if you're an airline, for example. Within an LMS or talent management, there's a lot more push and pull of information. And we do a lot of work with extended value chains, supply chains organizations, and that's where we have typically a beautiful front end to the system with a portal, whatever it may be. But within compliance, it's more often a push. You're pushing out information. You have a key identified individuals. You may not know who the individuals are, but you know maybe a job role, a specification, a piece of machinery they're working on that need to push it out to. So it's a push, and it's identifying around roles and behaviors within the system. The next part of it is communicating those requirements to those users, and particularly to those managers. Within any regulated business, the person who is responsible, the compliance officer or the chief pilot or the person who's responsible for conduct with the FDA, if they're getting an inspection from the Food and Drug Administration, they need to be able to pull the information up onto the system and see a traffic light system, for example. Who's in compliance, who's in a grace period, who's working on a manufacturing line where an SOP has changed, they've not been up to date on a new SOP. It's very important that's communicated in a clean, efficient way and no one falls through the gaps. Monitoring that really comes down to many things, but it comes down to analytics. There's a lot of data within a compliance-oriented solution. If you're looking at quality management, it might be data that's coming from the manufacturing line that's coming into the LMS. For example, has someone who's received the training on how to make a new gearbox, do they have less error rates than someone who hasn't received the training? You want to drill down to that. Maybe someone, as the vehicle comes off the production line and goes out to a dealership, someone who received the training at the dealership level, do they sell more vehicles than someone who doesn't? So you're linking the learning management system through into the manufacturing systems, through into dealer management systems, through into CRM systems. It's more that sort of integration than maybe what you typically see with an LMS into an HR system. So there's still touch points with the organization, but they are different. And you've taken all those data feeds and put it into an analytics system and drilling down to the error rates, the deviances from perfection, and also maybe profitability within that as well. So if you've been listening, which some of you may have, some of you may not, how many of you here actually do some form of gap analysis or risk assessment for compliance? Hands up, people who do. 1, 2, 3 or 4. Okay. It's something I probably suggest you do. If you are in the compliance business or you are focused on quality management, it's something that you should be doing on a regular basis. This is a nice example. I've mentioned a few things around aviation, manufacturing, life sciences. This is a great example on one of those big old companies that no one's ever heard of, but they're very large in what they do. So Fresenius, in 2012 did just shy of about 14 billion and made a nice healthy profit on top of that. They're the largest medical device manufacturer in the world. In fact, if you are a recipient of dialysis in the NHS in the UK, it's actually machines that Fresenius make that give you that dialysis. And they're one of the largest medical device manufacturers globally. And they operate everything from medical devices, health centres, diagnostics, end pharmaceutical products, etc. In their case, they're governed by the US regulations around the Food and Drug Administration. They're governed by the EU GMP practices. And what's collectively called the GXPs, good laboratory practice, good manufacturing practice, a lot of acronyms in this. What they're after is zero error rate on a manufacturing line. If they have an error on a manufacturing facility making a dialysis machine, the consequences are huge. In the case of companies like Fresenius, they get inspected by the FDA. If the FDA do an inspection and they provide a warning letter to a company like this, the typical reaction of the company is to shut down the manufacturing facility within a week. The risks of having any errors within the system are too great. The fines are too large, the risk of reputation is too large. So, although this is compliance, it's all about quality and quality assurance, quality management. Virgin Atlantic, if you fly on a plane, you want to make sure they don't drop out of the sky. Every airline has to do this, whether it's Airbus, Boeing, whatever the aircraft may be. There's an awful lot of assessments within the system. I think they do about 22,000 assessments a year for flight crew, cabin crew, ground staff, etc. And we do this with a number of other airlines as well. And it's making sure that people are certified and qualified, and they have the audit trail that they're allowed to operate maybe a Boeing door versus an Airbus door. There's different newtons pressure resistance on an Airbus door than there is on a Boeing door. You have to be qualified and certified in that. If it goes wrong, and there's an incident on an aircraft, they don't do an evacuation at the right time, and the CAA do an inspection, and they can't prove that the cabin crew were certified on the correct door type, they'll get fined. Nuffield Health, actually, if some of you have the book, I know the chap over there has got the book there of the event, there's a case study on Nuffield in the system. Nuffield actually are the largest provider of private healthcare in the UK. They're actually a not-for-profit. Many of the, what we view as private healthcare actually is not-for-profit, and Nuffield is a very good example of that. They also do health clubs, everything around health. So they're governed by the MHRA. In that system, there's a lot of detail drilling down to the system for all 10,000 employees. And the use of data and real data, big data within the system, and pulling it out to the board of the organisation is what keeps them going. They want to avoid any issues. Nuffield made the press a couple of years ago for being the outstanding company with the breast implant scare when the wrong sort of silicone was used by a French company in France. Nuffield made the press for all the right reasons. Their compliance was perfect, and they could identify every patient they had operated on who had these implants versus other implants. They brought them in, they offered them a minor procedure to make the change, and they were on the BBC for being an amazing organisation with their clients. Other organisations were hauled across the coals because they couldn't drill down into data who had done the operations, when they'd done the operations, had they checked the equipment, etc. So that's where a good example where compliance actually trickles down into a private organisation making money. So our focus really is around compliant, highly regulated businesses, be they airlines, medical device manufacturers, hospitals, etc. And we do a lot within mobile around that as well. Now, I'll touch on the mobile in a minute. A good example of mobile working is with the compliance arena is if a crew is flying an aircraft, they do a lot of training in the simulators. There's also something called an in-flight supervisory assessment. The chief pilot or the chief training officer sits on the flight deck and they watch the crew, how they operate the flight deck of the aircraft. And it's called CRM, Crew Resource Management. And a great example of this happening was the new Airbus 380, and it was on a flight from Singapore back to Australia when it was first launched. And one of the engines blew up and bits of engines dropped over Indonesia. That flight actually had the top 3 pilots from Qantas on board their aircraft, and they brought the aircraft down. What they're actually doing, they had 6 pilots on board the aircraft. They only needed 3, they had 6. Because what actually they were doing an in-flight supervisory assessment, and they were monitoring the behaviour of the flight crew, and they're doing it on a mobile device. And that's the sort of thing that we do with organisations. And I'll touch on a bit later on that trickle down of supervisory assessments on mobile devices and around compliance on that. The main areas around compliance are learning. The learning management system, it probably needs no introduction. Everyone should know what a learning management system is. Everyone knows what a performance management system is. The big difference within compliance is a performance management system is used for all the employees in an organization. Maybe another type of performance management system for more a broad brush talent management company is used for the high performers, the high potentials in an organization. We're doing it for everyone. It doesn't matter if you are working on a piece of machinery or you're an aspirational C-level person in the company, you use a performance management system. The analytics is pulling all that data that I mentioned and putting it all together and drilling down to see where the issues are. And the exams, well, exams to many people are a knowledge-checking device. To us, exams are high-stakes examinations. Is someone licensed to operate an aircraft? Is someone licensed to use a machine? Is someone qualified to sell a vehicle? This is what we use exams for. It's high-stakes examinations. So, how about non-compliance orientated businesses? What has been the trickle-down of this? Some great examples are, we work with a large mobile phone retailer in the UK, and they actually do the same thing I described on that Qantas aircraft. They do supervisory assessments. They do them on iPhones and Google Android phones, and they do it in the stores. If you work in a mobile phone shop, likelihood is a very high staff turnover. There's a big churn on that staff. It's a very young workforce. The people in those shops don't have email addresses. The store might have an email address. The manager might have an email address, but the individual employees in that store don't. So what the regional managers are doing is they're doing supervisory assessments on mobile phones. And they're able to just do it using a 3G connection when out on the road going from store to store. It's no different to an in-flight supervisory assessment for a pilot of a Boeing aircraft or an Airbus 380. It's the same logic. They can also then sign off with a e-signature on the mobile device as well. Even up to a few years ago, when you did a performance appraisal, you do the performance appraisal on your wonderful online system, and then you'd have to print it out and get your manager to sign it, you would sign it, and then you'd file it away. It's just nuts. So what you're seeing now is the use of e-signatures within performance appraisals. That's a great example of the technology within compliance rolling down to everyone else. We're also seeing within extended enterprise value chains as well. If you have a dealership network or a franchise network, I'd actually say that's probably the most compliance-orientated type of business you could have. If you are a McDonald's, you want to make sure that every McDonald's you go into, whether it's one in Jakarta, London, Paris, is the same experience. It's all about quality assurance. Any large brand is focused about its quality, its name, and its brand recognition, making sure that brand is never tarnished in any way. That is quality management. So even retailers are focusing on what I'd call compliance. They would probably call brand loyalty, quality assurance. Okay? So that has been the trickle down within the system. I'd like to open up to any questions you may have from the floor. Hopefully I've managed to keep it reasonably engaging. Any questions from the floor? No? Okay, we're just over there on stand 48. Pop over and see us. If you don't have any questions, we also have umbrellas and it's a rainy day outside. Okay, so you can grab an umbrella. Okay, thanks very much for your time.